They didn't pick me because I was patient. They picked me because I was predictable. That's the part people misunderstand about mentor programs. Companies don't assign mentors to develop talent. They assign mentors to absorb responsibility, soften blowback, and quietly manage the people no one else wants to deal with. I'd done that for years. Never loud, never dramatic. Just the guy who closed loops and didn't embarrass management. So when my manager, Elaine, handed me the folder and said, "You'll be mentoring our new compliance assistant," I already knew the script. I teach him the basics. I run interference. I keep him from asking the wrong questions in the wrong rooms. That was what I assumed anyway. The kid, his name was Aiden, showed up on Monday with a backpack too big for his shoulders and a level of energy that made everyone in the office suddenly very invested in their screens. He shook my hand too eagerly, called me sir, then immediately apologized for calling me sir. Young, nervous, harmless. But harmless people ask the most dangerous questions. We spent the morning going through onboarding checklists. I showed him the workflows, the shared drives, the naming conventions that stopped making sense 4 reorganizations ago. He took notes like he was preparing for the bar exam. Around lunch, he asked the first question that made me pay attention. "So, why are there 2 compliance drives? The one everyone uses and the one with the older timestamp no one seems to touch?" He wasn't wrong, but people who last in this industry learn to stop noticing things like that. "It's legacy," I said, standing up to refill coffee I didn't need. "Old system. We keep it archived." He nodded like that made sense. It didn't, and we both knew it. After lunch, we worked through vendor reports. Dry, repetitive, predictable. The part of the job where a mentor doesn't really mentor, he just gives context. Aiden was quick. Too quick. He noticed variance patterns faster than some of the senior analysts. "You said this vendor hasn't billed us in 2 years," he said, pointing at a line item. "But the system shows activity 6 months ago." "That's a mistake," I said automatically, except it wasn't. The timestamp was clean. The entry was real. But the attached reconciliation file was missing. Again, something you notice, then choose what to do with. Aiden didn't choose. He clicked. And that was the moment everything shifted. On his second day, he opened a folder he shouldn't have had access to. The legacy compliance drive no one touched, unless they were preparing for an audit or trying to bury something. I'd forgotten the folder even existed. But the kid didn't know he wasn't supposed to open it, so he opened everything. I watched the screen load, line by line, slowly at first, then faster as the system caught up, and then it stopped. A single red cell blinked in the corner of the sheet, a warning flag the original author probably thought they'd removed. "Why is this account off by so much?" Aiden asked. My throat tightened before I understood why. The discrepancy was real. The number was real. And the gap wasn't a typo, a rounding issue, or the usual sloppiness of people who get comfortable after years in the same job. It was $740,000, not charged, not reconciled, not corrected, just missing. Aiden leaned closer to the screen, oblivious to the weight of what he was touching. "Should we tell Elaine?" he asked. In our department, that question wasn't naive. It was dangerous. I closed the laptop slowly, deliberately, like I was putting a lid on boiling water. "No," I said quietly. "Not yet." He blinked, but it looks serious. "It is," I replied, which is exactly why we're not running into a manager's office without knowing the full picture. He sat back, processing. I could almost see the gears turning, protocol, ethics, best practices, none of which matter when you don't understand how an organization protects itself. "Okay," he said finally. "Then what do we do?" What we did was different from what I did. I walked him through the basics for the rest of the afternoon, but my mind wasn't in the room. My thoughts were on that folder, that account, that number. There are 2 kinds of violations in corporate life, the kind created by incompetence and the kind created by intention. $740,000 didn't disappear because someone wasn't paying attention. Someone paid too much attention. At 5:02, when the office lights flickered into night mode, Elaine stuck her head out of her office. "All good with the new hire?" she asked, voice bright, tone too casual. "First week jitters," I said. "Nothing major." She smiled, a polished, managerial smile, and closed her door again. Aiden left 5 minutes later, waving awkwardly. "See you tomorrow, sir. Yeah, see you tomorrow." When the elevator doors closed, I finally reopened the laptop. The file loaded instantly this time. Same discrepancy. Same missing reconciliation. Same vendor name. A company I knew well. Too well. I traced the trail backward, line by line, year by year, and that's when I saw it. A pattern in the adjustments. Subtle. Intentional. A structure only visible when you're not supposed to be looking for it. Someone had been siphoning money through compliance adjustments. Small amounts, spread across years, hidden under vendor transitions and one-time corrections. Not enough to trigger automatic reviews, but enough to add up to $740,000, enough to destroy someone's career, or several careers. I sat there for a long minute, not angry, not panicked, just aware. Aware of the fact that my manager didn't pick me by accident, aware that someone expected me to guide the kids safely away from the wrong folders, aware that the mentor program might not be mentorship at all. It might be containment. I closed the file and locked my screen. When I walked out of the building, the lobby felt colder than usual, and for the first time in years, I wasn't walking toward my car. I was walking toward a problem someone thought I'd never be willing to touch. I was wrong, and they were wronger. Tomorrow I would find out who created that $740,000 gap, and why they were so sure no one would ever look at it again. I barely slept that night, not because I was scared. Fear comes later when you understand the consequences, but because my mind wouldn't stop arranging and rearranging the pieces. Compliance violations don't just happen. They require access, timing, and a level of confidence bordering on arrogance. By the time my alarm went off, I'd already reviewed the numbers 3 more times. Every pass told the same story. The adjustments weren't sloppy. They were crafted. When I walked into the office, Aiden was already at his desk, typing fast with the energy of someone who still believes work rewards effort. "Morning," he said, too bright. "Morning," I answered, setting down my bag. He hesitated. "Should we look at that file again?" "No," I said. "Not yet." He looked confused, but he nodded. To his credit, he didn't push. I respected that more than I expected to. At 9:20, Elaine called me into her office. Her glass walls were frosted just enough to suggest transparency without offering any. She gestured for me to sit, then closed the door, a sign she wanted control of the narrative before anyone heard anything they shouldn't. "So," she began, folding her hands, "how's our new star student?" "Sharp," I said honestly. "Curious." Elaine didn't like that word. Curiosity is welcome in marketing, not in compliance. "Well," she said carefully, "we want to make sure he has structure. This program is important, and I need you to guide the flow of what he's exposed to." "Meaning?" I asked, though I already knew. "Meaning start with simple tasks," she said. "Vendor profiles, old reconciliations, nothing too deep yet." She held my eyes longer than necessary. There it was, contained, controlled. A polite way to say, keep him away from the things that matter. I sat back slightly. "Did someone raise a concern?" She smiled in that managerial way that answers nothing. "It's just protocol." Protocol. The corporate version of, "Don't touch the stove I left burning." I stood, understood. When I walked out, irritation prickled under my skin. Elaine wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what lived in that legacy drive. Or she knew who did. Either way, she wasn't trying to protect Aiden. She was trying to protect someone else. At 10:04, the first domino fell. Aiden rolled his chair to my desk and spoke in a low voice. "This might be nothing, but I got a permission error." For what? For the old compliance folder, he whispered. I tried opening it again and it says access was revoked. I froze. Not restricted. Not archived. Revoked. Someone noticed we opened it yesterday. Who revoked it? I asked. Aiden shrugged helplessly. I just send an automatic email. Permissions adjusted per management request. No name. My jaw tightened. Don't try to access it again. But don't, I repeated more firmly. He sat back, confused, maybe a little hurt. I didn't have the luxury of easing his feelings. Someone was already moving pieces behind the scenes. And if they were fast enough to revoke access, 12 hours after we opened the file, they were nervous. Nervous meant sloppy soon. Sloppy meant traceable. Before lunch, the second domino fell. I got an email from finance. Routine on the surface, but the timing didn't smell right. Subject line, review request, vendor 618B, 618B, the same vendor from the legacy discrepancies. Attached was a sanitized summary file, freshly generated, with none of the historical adjustments. It looked clean. Too clean. Someone was trying to overwrite history. I walked the document down the hall to finance. Not to confront anyone, just to watch reactions. Real guilt isn't in the words. It's in the pauses. I found Marcus, senior analyst, 10 years in the company, quiet, methodical, the kind of man whose spreadsheets probably had spreadsheets. This your request? I asked. He shook his head. Nope. That came from upstairs. Upstairs where? He shrugged. Director level. I can check names, but it'll show the same thing it always does. Auto-generated from an executive queue. Executive queue, meaning someone high enough to hide behind automation. Marcus glanced at the file. Why? Something off? I kept my tone casual, just connecting documents for training. He nodded and returned to his keyboard. The third domino didn't fall. It was pushed. At 1:47 p.m., Aiden approached my desk again, quiet, hesitant. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why are people acting weird today? He wasn't wrong. Elaine had been pacing her office. One of the senior managers from Risk stopped by compliance twice, without speaking to anyone. And IT had walked through our floor, pretending to check cables. People aren't acting weird, I said. They're acting aware. Aware of what? I looked him directly in the eyes. Of the fact that you saw something yesterday you weren't meant to see? His face drained. Did I get us in trouble? No, I said firmly. You did your job. And that was true. He wasn't the problem. The problem was whoever depended on no one doing their job too well. Before he could ask more, Elaine appeared beside us like she'd materialized from static. Team meeting, conference room B now. Her voice was tight. A little too tight for a team meeting. We followed her into the room. Blinds down, doors shut. 3 managers already sitting. Risk, internal controls, and vendor oversight. Not normal. Not random. Elaine cleared her throat. There was an access event yesterday in the Legacy Compliance Archive, she said. We need to address what was opened and why. Aiden shot me a panicked look. I kept my face neutral. I supervised the access. It was part of his onboarding. Risk manager leaned forward. The folder contains sensitive, outdated data. Then revoke my access, I replied calmly. Not his. Internal controls exchanged a glance with Elaine, the kind that said this wasn't the direction they wanted the conversation going. We're not assigning blame, she said. We're ensuring alignment. Corporate nonsense. A polite way of saying, we're making sure the wrong people don't ask the right questions. But they'd made a mistake. They assumed I'd play along the way I always had. I looked at the risk manager. If there's an issue with the archive, you should audit who created the adjustments. Silence. A heavy one. The kind that means someone didn't expect that sentence to be spoken out loud. Elaine's voice sharpened. That won't be necessary. But it would, because the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the pattern. The meeting ended abruptly. No conclusions, no action items, just tension. As we stepped out, Aiden whispered, Are we in trouble? No, I said softly. But someone is. He swallowed. Who? That's what we're going to find out. And I didn't know it yet. Not fully, but that decision would cost someone everything. The meeting changed something in me. Not suddenly, not like flipping the switch, but gradually, the way a floor settles after years of wait. I'd spent most of my career being useful, predictable, safe. Someone who didn't make noise. Someone who fixed things quietly. But that room, the way Elaine avoided my eyes, the way risk and controls leaned back like I'd stepped out of line just by asking who adjusted the numbers, that told me more than the file ever could. They weren't trying to prevent a misunderstanding. They were trying to keep someone's fingerprints off the record. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I didn't want to be the person who pretends not to see. Aiden followed me out of the conference room like a shadow. He didn't speak until we reached our desks. Should I stop looking into things? He asked quietly. The old version of me would have said yes. The safe version, the version management expected, but that version was already cracking. No, I said, but you're not opening anything without me. His shoulders eased, and for a moment he looked relieved. Grateful, even. He wasn't reckless. He was earnest. And earnest people can get eaten alive in places like this. At 3:12 p.m., the fourth domino fell. I received a meeting invite. Title: 1-1 Review. Grant. From Karen Doyle, Director of Compliance. Karen wasn't part of our day-to-day operations. She was hire, the kind of hire that doesn't bother with middle management unless there's a reason, and she never sent meetings directly. She had an assistant and a chain of command. But the invite came straight from her inbox. Immediate, unignorable. I accepted. Before the meeting, I went to the only person who would tell me the truth without telling me the truth. Dan from IT. Every company has a Dan. Older, unimpressed, knows where the bodies are buried because he maintains the servers they were buried in. I found him in the break room, pouring coffee that had already died twice. Hey, I said casually. You guys changed permissions on the old compliance archive? He snorted. Not my call. Came from upstairs. Name? He lifted an eyebrow. Why? Because I need to know if the change was routine. He let that sit in the air like smoke. Routine? No. That folder's been dormant since before COVID. No one touches archives unless something's moving. Moving how? He shrugged. Either someone's cleaning up, or someone's hiding. Both look the same on the back end. My stomach tightened. And whose request was it? I pressed. He didn't say the name out loud. He didn't have to. He tapped his mug with his finger. 3 slow taps. 3rd floor. Director level. Karen's floor. I thanked him and walked out. By the time I reached the director's suite, I had accepted one truth. This wasn't a mistake someone hoped would go unnoticed. This was a structure someone built and protected. Karen's office had a view of the city and a door that cost more than my first car. She waved me in without standing, the posture of someone who expects compliance by default. Grant, she said pleasantly. Close the door? I did. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was worse, polite with an undertone of rehearsed authority. I've been informed you accessed a restricted archive yesterday, she began. I supervised the access, I corrected gently. Onboarding. Unscheduled onboarding, she said. You should follow documented pathways. She slid a printed policy across the table. I didn't touch it. I knew corporate theater when I saw it. We need alignment, she continued. Legacy files contain sensitive historical data. Opening them without clearance can lead to misunderstandings. Her pause was intentional. Is that a warning? I asked. A reminder, she said smoothly. Focus on your mentee. Teach him structured processes. Nothing beyond his scope. Nothing beyond his scope. Nothing beyond the story they needed him to believe. Then she leaned back. If you have questions about old accounts, Bring them directly to me, directly to her, meaning don't involve anyone else, meaning she had something to protect. Understood, I said, but she misread the word. She heard agreement. What I meant was acknowledgement. When I left her office, the hallway felt narrower, as if the building itself was closing in around the truth. At my desk, Aiden was reorganizing a vendor list. He looked up, concerned. How'd it go? They don't want us looking backward, I said. He frowned. Shouldn't compliance always look backward? Isn't that the point? I almost smiled. Yes, but not when backward leads somewhere they don't want to go? His eyes widened. It finally clicked. Grant, are you saying someone did this on purpose? I'm saying, I replied, someone created a structure that only works if no one questions it. He swallowed. And we did. We did, I confirmed. For a moment he was quiet, then in a small voice, what happens now? What happens now? Good question. At 5:21 p.m., I got my first answer. I was packing up for the day when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop digging. This isn't your fight. No signature, no context. Just a message someone sends when they think threats carry weight. I stared at the screen, then looked around the office. No eyes on me, no lingering shadows. Just cubicles, fluorescent lights, and quiet. I locked my phone. On the walk to the parking garage, the realization settled fully. Not dramatically, not like a punch, but like a conclusion I'd been avoiding. I'd been loyal to a company that assumed I'd stay asleep. They'd mistaken silence for obedience. And that was the night something hardened in me. Not anger, not fear, resolve. A quiet, steady resolve that doesn't need permission or approval. Because I wasn't digging out of curiosity anymore. I was digging because someone clearly didn't want me to. And the difference between the two? Curiosity stops when told. Resolve doesn't. When I got home, I opened my laptop, pulled up the last accessible vendor files, and began mapping patterns. Slowly at first, then faster, as the connections revealed themselves. The $740,000 gap wasn't a single event. It was an accumulation, a structure, a method, and one name started appearing in adjacent documents, not in the file itself, never directly, but close enough to the perimeter to suggest involvement. Someone with access, authority, longevity. Someone who wouldn't expect me to look twice. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Everything I believed about my department was about to shift, because the discrepancy wasn't an accident. It was a system, and tomorrow, the part they'd tried to hide would become impossible to ignore. By the next morning, the pattern was undeniable. Not the numbers, those were already clear, but the structure around them. The permissions changes, the meeting with Karen, the sanitized vendor file, the anonymous text. None of it existed in isolation. All of it pointed in one direction. This wasn't a compliance error. It was a compliance shelter. Someone had built themselves a corner of the system where money could move quietly, slowly, safely, as long as no one opened the wrong folders. But Aiden had opened one, and I had refused to close it. When I arrived at the office, the atmosphere had changed again. People were quieter, more deliberate. Conversations paused when I walked by, the way they do when people don't know whether to treat you like a colleague or a problem. Aiden looked exhausted, the kind of tired you get when you realize the floor under you isn't solid. "They moved my workstation," he said as I approached. I stared at the empty desk beside mine, then at the new desk they'd assigned him 2 rows away, right under the supervisor's window, monitored, contained, separated. "Did they give you a reason?" I asked. "Better collaboration with the team," he said, "but they didn't specify which team." There it was again, corporate language designed to mean nothing while accomplishing something. I pulled out my chair. "Stay calm. Keep doing normal work. Don't open anything that isn't assigned." He nodded, but worry lingered behind his eyes. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid he'd dragged me into something. He hadn't. I walked in willingly. At 9:11 a.m., the fifth domino fell, and this one didn't fall quietly. A system alert flashed on my screen. Suspicious activity detected. Vendor 628B. Not from me, not from Aiden, from a real-time audit tool that only triggered when new changes clashed with historical patterns. Someone was editing the file. Someone was actively restructuring the data, and they were doing it right now. I stood, walked directly to IT, and found Dan pulling cables under a desk. "Who's modifying the 618B records?" I asked. He froze, not dramatically, but with the stillness of someone who recognizes the shape of trouble. "I can't tell you that," he said. I crouched beside him. "Dan, the system flagged it. It's not an old adjustment. Someone's rewriting." He closed his eyes briefly, then sighed. "Third floor. Same queue as before." "Karen's floor." "Of course. You didn't hear it from me," he said. "And Grant, be careful. People don't rewrite history unless they're scared of the truth." I returned to my desk, opened a blank notepad, and started mapping timestamps. Every adjustment in the last 5 minutes had the same administrative signature ID, a masked one, which meant the edits came from someone with director-level override privileges. Not a manager, not a senior analyst, a director, and there were only two in compliance, Karen Doyle and the VP above her, Robert Stanton. Stanton was the kind of executive who didn't say good morning unless HR was within earshot. Quiet, calculated, not sloppy, which meant only one thing. If files were being rewritten this sloppily, it wasn't Stanton. It was Karen. Before I could process that fully, another meeting invite appeared. Compliance alignment session, mandatory room, executive conference 3A. Attendees, all risk, controls, compliance leads, and me. A mandatory meeting with no agenda. Corporate code for someone is about to control the narrative. As I walked in, Karen stood at the head of the table, projecting the calm confidence of someone who thinks the room belongs to her. Elaine sat to her right, risk manager to her left, internal controls beside him, and a seat across from Karen, the only open one, obviously meant for me. I sat. Karen folded her hands. "We've had a few irregularities in our legacy systems," she began, "due to onboarding activities that didn't follow proper pathways." Her eyes flicked to me. She wasn't addressing the room. She was addressing the threat. "We're initiating a compliance freeze," she continued. "No historical vendor data is to be accessed until my office completes a controlled review." A freeze. The nuclear option of bureaucratic damage control. Risk manager nodded. "Agreed. This ensures stability." Internal controls added, "Pending review, no employees outside director level will access archived reconciliations." Aiden was being cut off entirely. So was I. Karen looked at me like she expected a fight. She didn't understand me at all. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked at her and asked calmly, "So who will conduct this review?" She blinked, a half second too long. "My office," she said. "Of course. Because letting anyone else look at the numbers would end her career." I nodded. "Understood." And I meant it in the same way I meant it in her office the day before. Acknowledgement, not agreement. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Everyone filed out quietly, except Elaine, who stopped at the door. "Grant," she said softly, "you should let this go." Her tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't threatening. It was almost pleading. "Why?" I asked. "Because you don't know the whole story," she whispered. "And you do?" She didn't answer. She just swallowed, looked away, and left. That told me everything. This wasn't just Karen acting alone. This was a structure built over years. Multiple hands, multiple approvals, multiple people who benefited from the same silence. On my way back to my desk, Aiden intercepted me. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Worse than you think," I said. He lowered his voice. "Are we stopping?" "No." He exhaled shakily. "What do we do now?" "We stop playing defense," I said, and we stop assuming they're smarter than they look. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed late under the pretense of finishing cycle reports, waited until the building emptied, then walked quietly to the business center where the internal audit terminals were located. Not the usual machines, the dedicated stations used for formal audits. They had a feature IT didn't advertise. They logged everything, including overwritten data, especially overwritten data. I logged in with my credentials, basic, restricted, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flashed. Elevated review privileges temporarily granted via Audit Shadow Protocol. It was a loophole, a rare one, meant for auditors during freezes. Someone had forgotten to close it. Not magic, not coincidence, human error. The one force more reliable than any system. I searched the legacy vendor path. Every overwritten file had a shadow copy. Every deleted timestamp had an original. And one name appeared in the metadata. Not Karen, not Stanton. Someone else. Someone no one suspected. Someone who'd been in the company longer than both of them. I stared at the screen as the truth settled in. It wasn't just a director. It wasn't just a manager. It was someone who had access for a decade. Someone who knew how to hide in plain sight. And as the final document loaded, one sentence left my mouth before I could stop it. "Oh, so that's who you are." I didn't know it yet, not fully, but exposing that name would ignite the kind of chaos they thought they'd buried years ago. And tomorrow morning, the person behind the $740,000 structure would understand the one thing they'd miscalculated. I wasn't loyal to the company anymore. I was loyal to the truth. The name on the audit shadow metadata didn't belong to Karen or Stanton. It belonged to someone quieter, someone no one ever paid attention to unless the system went down or the numbers didn't align. Michael Hawthorne, Senior Compliance Architect, 15 years in the company, never took sick days, never changed cubicles, the kind of employee people describe as reliable, only because they can't describe anything else about him. I remembered him from every orientation I'd ever attended. Gray sweaters, monotone voice, the human equivalent of a loading bar. And suddenly it all made sense. The pattern wasn't built by someone ambitious. It was built by someone invisible. Someone who lived deep inside the framework, who understood exactly where controls were weakest and oversight was laziest. Someone whose work no one second-guessed because no one cared enough to check. A hidden engineer of silence. Not the villain people imagine. Not flashy, not charismatic, not dramatic. Just patient. The kind of patience that creates a $740,000 hole one routine adjustment at a time. I stayed at the audit terminal until 1:23 a.m., pulling every shadow copy, every buried timestamp, every authorization code. I didn't alter anything. I didn't move anything. I simply made a clean chronological chain. A chain that couldn't be rewritten. A chain that didn't depend on my memory. A chain the company couldn't ignore. At 7:46 a.m., before the building even filled, I walked directly to internal audit. Not compliance, not Karen, not Elaine. Internal audit, the only department that doesn't report to anyone inside compliance. The director, a sharp woman named Perez, looked up as I entered. "Grant, you're not due for review." "I'm submitting a red file report," I said. Her eyebrows lifted. "On what grounds?" I placed the printed chain of evidence on her desk. "Misappropriation through legacy compliance structures," I said. 15 years of adjustments tied to a single architect. I have timestamps, overrides, shadow files, and permission logs. Perez didn't react. Professionals like her never do. She simply opened the first binder, scanned the first page, then the second. By the third, she closed the cover and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, respect. "Sit," she said. I did. "What has compliance said about this?" she asked. "Nothing," I replied. They attempted to freeze access and centralize review under a director whose permissions are tied to several overwritten files. Perez exhaled once, not dramatically but sharply, the way someone acknowledges a line has been crossed. "You understand what you're alleging?" she said. "I'm not alleging," I answered. "I'm reporting." She pressed a button on her desk phone. "I need a secured audit pod opened, and 2 analysts assigned to me immediately." The next hour felt like a slow, controlled ignition. 2 auditors entered. The evidence was logged. A sealed record was created. My statement was taken. Aiden's name went into the file, not as a suspect, but as the initial observer. Perez closed the binder at 9:12 a.m. "Stay available," she said. "Do not discuss this with anyone. Not your manager, not your mentee, not your department leadership. This is now a formal investigation." I stood, understood. This time the word meant agreement. When I stepped back onto our floor, everything felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just honest. Aiden looked up immediately. "Something happened, didn't it?" "It's handled," I said. "Don't ask anything else." He nodded, and for the first time since this mess started, he looked genuinely relieved. Not because he understood the details, but because he trusted me enough to believe the danger was shifting away from him. At 10:43 a.m., it began. A team from internal audit walked straight onto our floor. Not quietly, not politely. Audit doesn't tiptoe. They announce themselves by existing. Perez led them. Karen stepped out of her office, trying to keep her expression neutral, but her posture betrayed her. Spine rigid, fingers white around her coffee mug. "Karen Doyle?" Perez asked. "Yes," Karen replied. "I need you to join us in Conference 2F. Now." Karen blinked. "What is this regarding?" Perez didn't answer. She didn't have to. The presence of audit answered for her. They walked her away. 15 minutes later, 2 more auditors arrived and stopped at a cubicle halfway down the row. Michael's cubicle. He looked up slowly, confusion spreading across his face like ink. "Michael Hawthorne?" one auditor asked. "Yes," he said cautiously. "We need to speak with you. Bring your badge and step away from the workstation." Michael glanced at me. A brief flicker like a man trying to match faces to outcomes. Maybe he suspected. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd been expecting this day for years. But the look he gave me wasn't anger. It was disappointment, as if he'd believed he'd built something too elegant to be found. They escorted him out quietly. No handcuffs, no scene. Just procedure. Internal audit handles things silently. HR met them by the elevators. Legal was already on standby. The rest of the floor froze. Elaine's voice cracked when she said, "Everyone, please return to your work." But no one believed her. By 2 p.m., the company issued a formal freeze notice. All compliance adjustments across 5 years were locked pending investigation. Vendor 6.8B, the shell through which the siphoning occurred, was suspended from the system. By 3 p.m., Karen's office door was locked. By 4 p.m., Michael's personal items were boxed. By the end of the week, Michael was terminated for gross misconduct and fraudulent manipulation of compliance structures. Karen was placed on administrative leave for failure to exercise oversight. 3 other mid-level managers received written warnings. The number everyone whispered about in hallways, 740,000, now had a name attached to it, and none of those names were mine or Aiden's. The following Monday, Stanton, the VP, called me into his office. He wasn't a man who smiled, but he tried. "Grant, internal audit informed me you initiated the red file report." "I did," I said. He clasped his hands. "You understand you bypassed your chain of command." "With respect," I replied. "My chain of command was involved." He didn't argue. Executives don't argue when the facts are already stamped, logged, and sealed. He exhaled. "Audit recommends recognizing your actions as corrective leadership." I didn't react. He cleared his throat. "We are offering you the role of senior compliance lead. Full authority over reconciliation frameworks. Salary adjustment included." It wasn't a reward. It was a containment strategy with a ribbon. But I accepted. Not for the title, but for the control it offered. Control I'd already earned. Outside Stanton's office, Aiden nearly collided with me. "Did they fire you?" he whispered. "No," I said. "They gave me a new job." His shoulders sagged. "Good. I don't know what I thought." I clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did well, Aiden. Better than you know." He swallowed, trying not to look too proud. "What happens now?" "Now?" I said. "You learn the part of compliance no one teaches." "And what's that?" "That the quietest people aren't always harmless," I said, "and the loudest warnings don't always make noise." He nodded thoughtfully. As I gathered my things that evening, the office felt honest again, not clean. No company is ever clean, but clarified. I didn't topple the system. I didn't burn it down. I simply held up a light in a room where everyone else pretended to see. At home, I cooked dinner, sat at my table, and felt something unusual settle in my chest. Peace. Not triumph. Not victory. Just peace. The kind that comes when you stop carrying the weight that was never yours. The company would survive. The structure would rebuild. People would whisper, gossip, move on. But Aiden, the kid who'd opened the wrong folder, still had a job, a future, and a mentor who now chose the truth over convenience. And Michael, the architect of silence, finally had a record the system couldn't bury. As for me, I slept that night with a clear mind, because revenge in real corporate life isn't fire or chaos. It's clarity. It's truth. It's giving people exactly what they earned. And what they earned this time was daylight.